Hello, and welcome back to Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm so glad to have you here again. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. In the previous episode, we talked about the origins of Oregon State Hospital, the initial good intentions involved in the treatment, and the rise of horrific practices like sterilization and lobotomy. If you haven't listened to that episode yet, please go back and have a listen first before you listen to this one, because it situates the hospital in history. As in the previous episode, I'm going to use a lot of material from the book Inside Oregon State Hospital by Diane L. Goeres-Gardner. Other sources will be listed throughout the episode and in the show notes. But now, I'm excited to bring you the second half of the history and treatment of Oregon State Hospital. In this episode, we'll discuss the problems of overcrowding, the legacy of the longest-serving superintendent, the role of the hospital in a multiple Academy Award-winning film, and the ongoing achievements and challenges of Oregon State Hospital. So come on in and get comfortable as we go behind the walls of Oregon State Hospital. We ended the last episode discussing the ban of lobotomies in Oregon in 1981. We're going to go a little back in time to 1954. At this time, Dr. Charles Bates was superintendent of Oregon State Hospital. There were only 11 physicians working with the over 2,700 patients who resided there. The American Psychiatric Association only conditionally approved the hospital that year due to deficiencies in organization, food management, and number of personnel. Around this time, there was only one staff member for every 10 patients. That same year, in 1954, a Methodist guild out of Salem began regular visits of a women's ward, even sometimes throwing parties. This began an Adopt a Ward program that would continue for years. A group from the community would adopt a ward at the hospital and decorate the wards with curtains, upholsteries for chairs, and paint the walls. They would hold parties with cupcakes and treats. Volunteers would teach crafts or dancing. They would play games with patients or put together puzzles. It was believed that doing so would reduce the stigma and fear of mental illness. By the end of December 1954, Dr. Bates retired from Oregon State Hospital after working there since 1914 and serving as superintendent for the previous 7 years. Starting January 1st, 1955, Dr. Dean Brooks became the new superintendent. He had started working at Oregon State Hospital 8 years prior, in 1947, as a staff psychiatrist. He was well liked by patients and seemed to be a good fit for the job. Dr. Brooks believed that the hospital had 3 main roles. First, the care and treatment of patients. Second, training personnel to care for the mentally ill. And third, research into mental illness. This 3-pronged approach led the way for Oregon State Hospital to become a leader in psychiatric treatment. His approach also changed public perspective. Now, the hospital was seen as a place where people got well, not where they were merely warehoused. Dr. Brooks stated that this was because the public's attitude toward mental illness had shifted. They now saw it as something that could be cured. The result was that voluntary admissions to the hospital increased. It was unclear based on what I read whether these admissions were the patients voluntarily admitting themselves because they knew they needed treatment, or if the families were responsible for admitting members that they believed needed treatment. But regardless, in 1947, only 20% of the admissions were voluntary, whereas by 1957, nearly 53% of admissions were voluntary. In 1955, there were 9 primary methods of treatment at Oregon State Hospital. The first was psychotherapy, which was generally provided in a group setting. The second was electroshock therapy, which was usually reserved for stubborn cases of depression. Third was insulin shock therapy, which was generally prescribed for folks with paranoid schizophrenia and little social interaction. The procedure induced a coma and seizure that many patients described as torture. I'll get into this form of treatment more in a future episode. The fourth was nutritional therapy, which generally included finding the right food and vitamins for each patient. Number 5, Milieu therapy provided patients more opportunities to interact informally with staff, to have agency in their decision-making, and to live and operate more independently within the hospital. Number 6, new heavy-hitting medications such as thorazine and reserpine produced a calming effect on more agitated patients. Number 7, attitude therapy, which involved the staff making changes to accommodate the patient's needs, not the other way around. Number 8, sedatives and hydrotherapy, or warm baths, were also used to calm patients. 9, occupational therapy was a relatively new form of treatment first introduced in 1950. It allowed patients to participate in certain vocational tasks as a form of relaxation and productivity. Over the years, patients involved in occupational therapy were assigned to sewing, rug making, basket weaving, gardening, among other skills. They worked with ceramics, copper enameling, leather, wood, needlework, printing, and oil painting. Although not a formal type of treatment, television sets began to show up in the wards around the hospital, and patients could be easily entertained. Early in Dr. Brooks' administration, hydrotherapy and insulin shock were discontinued as medications became the primary form of treatment. Also notable is that no lobotomies were performed at the hospital during Dr. Brooks' administration. In 1956, the hospital underwent a sort of beautification process. Open wards were introduced that allowed the patients to move more freely around the hospital. Better food with an improved rationing system allowed patients to have meat, eggs, and fresh vegetables daily. Restraints were used less frequently. As Goeres-Gardner points out, quote, the hospital looked better, smelled better, and had a better atmosphere, end quote. By the end of 1957, Dr. Brooks had advocated for an increased budget. There were now 27 physicians on staff, and his budget for medications had doubled. The 3 social workers on staff increased to 11, and a psychologist and 2 industrial therapists were added. Whereas the staff-to-patient ratio 10 years before had been 1 staff member for every 10 patients, now it was 1 staff member for every 3 to 4 patients. I should also add here that this is significant because the higher the number of staff, the lower the number of violent incidents. So essentially, more staff means a safer hospital. 1958 saw the highest number of patients in Oregon State Hospital history, with a record 3,545 patients. For as much progress as the hospital was making, overcrowding continued to be a concern. This was the start of the era of deinstitutionalization, where hospitals began to funnel patients into other avenues of community mental health care, like group homes or smaller institutional settings. As part of this movement, in 1961, Dammisch State Hospital opened in Wilsonville and was expected to house approximately 375 patients. Some patients from Oregon State Hospital were transferred to Dammisch around this time to relieve the problem of overcrowding. Dr. Brooks and then Governor Mark O. Hatfield, who I should add was from Dallas, Oregon, where I'm from, created the Mental Health Division to work in collaboration with county governments to develop community mental health systems, including child guidance programs, drug and alcohol treatment centers, and facilities for folks with intellectual disabilities. Back at the hospital, Dr. Brooks added Dr. Maxwell Jones to the staff as the hospital research and education director. Dr. Jones helped establish the concept of therapeutic communities throughout the hospital. Goeres-Gardner describes the first experiment, which, quote, started in Ward 9, one of the most difficult and troublesome of all the male wards in the hospital. Patients ranged from age 9 to 75. Some were rapists and murderers. Restraints were used often, and shock therapy was used on patients as many as 3 times a week. The door to the quiet room was scarred from being hit so many times, end quote. So, quick side note here. Does it bother anyone else that children as young as 9 were being housed in this ward? No? Just me? All right. The description continues, quote, The experiment spread to Ward 6, the ward next door, which housed senile and elderly women. Soon, paint covered the sunroom adjoining the two wards, while colorful murals decorated the walls, and a piano became available for impromptu music. The quiet room was converted into a shop, and patients happily prepared jelly donuts and participated in crafts. The women challenged the men to look better physically and act better socially. Both wards now ate together, assisting members who needed help and encouraging better behavior. End quote. Another highlight of the therapeutic communities was the addition of a patient council, where patients could practice advocacy and leadership skills. They shared their concerns and suggestions with Dr. Brooks and other staff. Notably, Dr. Brooks preferred that staff and patients alike call him Dean. In 1962, Dean Brooks completely restructured and reorganized the hospital to better accommodate the patient demographics. He introduced a med-surg unit for more medically fragile patients, a psychiatric security unit made up of 4 wards, including one just for women, and what he called a social living and rehabilitation unit. This unit was designed for patients preparing for discharge. They'd take classes on how to get a job, how to use public transportation, how to live in an apartment, and as a result, many patients were able to successfully transition back into the community. Another part of the reorganization included more stability for staff who were assigned to a specific ward and stayed there. This allowed for stronger bonds among staff and familiar faces for patients. By 1966, as a result of the deinstitutionalization process, the hospital population had decreased to 1,589. Almost 2,000 patients were admitted per year, but most only stayed a short period of time before they returned to the community. Because the number of patients had dropped by 2,000 over the previous decade, many staff feared that they would be let go. Instead, Dean Brooks allowed them to stay, which improved the staff-to-patient ratio and decreased rates of violence. 1960 filled with political upheavals and assassinations and cultural chaos, and Oregon was no exception. On March 9, 1968, a riot broke out at Oregon State Penitentiary next door to the hospital. 700 inmates were involved in the riot. They took over several buildings, set fire to some, and vandalizing others. They took guards and other employees hostage. 6 inmates served as spokespeople for the inmates' demands. They wanted better medical care, an expanded work release program, and the resignation of the warden. The siege lasted until the next day when the inmates' demands were met. Following the prison riot, some inmates were transferred to Oregon State Hospital, leading to 4 times the usual number of admissions from the next-door state pen. The following year, in 1969, the construction of the psychiatric security program was authorized, allowing for higher security patient areas. Prior to the 1970s, the laws in Oregon regarding criminal insanity stated that, quote, defendants could be found guilty except for insanity if they suffered from a mental disease or defect that drastically impaired control of judgment at the time of the crime, end quote. So the key phrase to note here is that the mental disease or defect must impair judgment at the time of the crime. However, in 1971, this was revised in Oregon law. See if you can catch the difference. Quote, a person is not responsible for a criminal act if at the time of the offense his mind is so impaired by disease or defect that he lacks substantial capacity either to appreciate the criminality of his conduct or to conform his conduct to the requirements of law, end quote. So the revised law broadens the definition to include people who may not realize that their actions constitute a crime. It's not simply that their judgment was impaired as it was before, but because they may not even be aware that they're committing a crime. This allowed for more folks to plead insanity and malinger insanity. In fact, the number of patients admitted as guilty except for insanity increased substantially in only a few years. In 1972, only 20 patients had been committed as GEI, guilty except for insanity. But by 1976, that number increased to 79. So because of the sudden increase, focus turned to the treatment of these patients rather than on their punishment. Dr. Brooks always seemed to be looking for new types of therapy. He was frequently seen rappelling down the walls of the hospital as he prepared for his next mountaineering trip. And so in 1972, he and another experienced mountain climber took 51 patients into the mountains of eastern Oregon for a hiking trip. Each patient was paired with a staff member as they trekked through the mountains, and a writer from Life magazine and a photographer were there to chronicle the trip. When they returned, it was so successful that many of the patients who participated were released. And as Goeres-Gardner notes, Dr. Brooks went on to found one of the most extensive wilderness adventure programs ever operated in a mental hospital. His other trips included skiing, whitewater rafting, and mountain climbing. Meanwhile, far from Oregon, in Czechoslovakia, a film director named Milos Forman was looking for a site for his new movie adaptation. It was a film about patients in a mental hospital and the larger-than-life anarchical figure that comes in and changes the way they see themselves and their confines. American actor Kirk Douglas had bought the rights in galley form of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey even before the book was published in 1962. He had adapted the book into a Broadway play and had sent the copy of the script to Milos to turn into a film. Unknown to both Kirk Douglas and Milos Forman, the script had been confiscated at the Czech border, and they went on to assume that the other simply hadn't been interested in the project. But Milos was still interested. So almost 10 years later, when Michael Douglas asked his father if he could have the rights and make the film with Milos, Kirk Douglas agreed. They just had one small problem. Every psychiatric hospital they visited turned them down when they asked to film there, and with good reason. If you're unfamiliar with the story, here's a very brief summary. A boisterous, eccentric criminal, R.P. McMurphy, evades time in prison by feigning psychosis and is sent to a mental hospital. There, he makes friends with other patients and enemies of the staff, especially Nurse Ratched. He helps his new friends make the most of their time at the hospital and even sneaks in booze and girls during a party. But of course, they are caught, and the end becomes a game of wills between R.P. McMurphy and Nurse Ratched. So, as you can imagine, most hospitals didn't particularly want to feature their site as a sort of hospital of horrors depicted in the book, except for Dean Brooks. He saw it as an opportunity for a more creative type of therapy. Other psychiatrists at the hospital, like Dr. Prasanna Pati, initially worried that the film would distract from patient care and turn the hospital into a sort of circus. But he too eventually came around to the idea. Dr. Brooks later revealed that he had to remind himself that it was a movie based on a book and not a documentary about Oregon State Hospital. He finally agreed that One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest would be filmed in Salem, with the caveat that his patients were not filmed as patients in the film, but instead that they would assist in the making of the film. He also suggested some revisions to the script, because the draft included some language that he said doctors wouldn't actually use. So Dr. Brooks went through the entire script along with Michael Douglas and made adjustments as needed. In the documentary Behind the Scenes, the story of cult films about this movie, both Dr. Brooks and Dr. Pati reveal that they were offered small roles as doctors in the film. Dr. Brooks faced off with Jack Nicholson in an entirely improvised scene. He recalled that they were given a list of 6 points to cover, and Milos told them to just go for it. The resulting approximately 6-minute scene was shot in just 2 takes. And I think Dr. Brooks is the star of the scene. He's funny and clever, and he gives Jack Nicholson this do not mess with me look over the top of his glasses that just pierces right through him. And the fact that none of it is scripted just shows how easily Dr. Brooks assumed the role and made the scene authentic. And as a side note, because it's an important point to me and probably only me, is the location of the scene. Behind Dr. Brooks, there are cars driving by on Center Street. In the background is the main hospital, meaning that this particular scene was actually filmed in the Dome building. And behind Jack Nicholson is a window with a brick building in the background. Now, this has always confused me a little bit, and bear with me because this is important to probably only me. If we are looking south from the Dome building at the main hospital, the building in that window behind Jack Nicholson should be looking northwest toward the birthing center where I was born, which was more of a yellow gold brick and like across a little side street. But because it's closer and red brick, I think it must be a mirror image and showing Brightonbush Hall to the east. I know. Like all this fuss for nothing, but it's my claim to fame, so let me have it. All right, reluctantly moving on. This film actually has some really big names in it. Jack Nicholson, of course, who plays R.P. McMurphy, but also Christopher Lloyd, who plays Mr. Tabor, and Danny DeVito, who plays Martini. And as a little fun fact, Danny DeVito also played Martini in the previous Broadway adaptation with Kirk Douglas. Louise Fletcher played Nurse Ratched so well, and I have to give her credit. Other actresses had turned the role down. I mean, who would want to play a woman villain during a period of women's rights? But she did it, and she was actually able to match the big energy coming from Jack Nicholson, which had to be a hard task. And before filming even started, the crew wanted cast members to get a better sense of what life was like for the patients. Director Milos Forman assigned actors to get to know one patient and follow them around and emulate them. See how they walk, see how they talk, etc. And from a psychologist perspective today, I have some reservations about that. I don't particularly know that I would want people following around my patients and essentially copying them. But that was some method acting for the day. Jack Nicholson and Louise Fletcher were tasked with watching a session of electroshock therapy. And if you've seen the film, Jack Nicholson's performance in the shock therapy scene is truly horrifying. Again, as a side note, I observed 3 sessions of electroconvulsive therapy, which is what we now call shock therapy, during my predoctoral internship. Today, the procedure is not used regularly, but it's for treatment-resistant forms of depression and aggression, really as a last resort. There are very few places that even offer ECT as an option. Patients go through multiple sessions over several months, and perhaps most importantly, a global anesthetic is used so the experience is not painful. Now, as promised, no actual patients were depicted as patients in the film. Instead, some played extras in certain scenes. They worked behind the scenes alongside electricians, gaffers, caterers, beauticians, and other roles. The behind the scenes documentary interviews patients who had some of these roles, and they all stated that they felt like, quote, normal people doing a normal job just alongside Hollywood actors. There were some blunders during this process, though, since somehow many of the crew members didn't realize they were working with people who had actually committed crimes. So when a group of sex offenders quickly volunteered for the janitorial jobs near the actresses' dressing rooms, it didn't concern anyone until later. Or when the most notorious arsonist in Oregon began working with the electrical department, no one realized there might be a conflict of interest. But blunders aside, no incidents involving these folks were recorded. There was one tragedy that occurred during the filming. William Redford, the actor who played Mr. Harding, was diagnosed with leukemia by Dr. Dean Brooks himself. Dr. Brooks estimated that the actor had about 18 months to live, and his prediction ended up being true. William Redford died the following year in 1976. After the movie was complete, it premiered in theaters around the world. Michael Douglas saw a screening in Paris and said that after the final scene, there wasn't a single sound, and he wondered if the audience actually hated it. But suddenly the theater erupted in cheering and clapping. And in the US, there were premieres in Hollywood, Chicago, and Seattle. Louise Fletcher attended the premiere in Chicago and said that the audience members jumped out of their seats and cheered when McMurphy strangles Nurse Ratched. That had to be strange as the person actually playing Nurse Ratched in the film. But these major cities weren't the only ones who premiered the film. A special screening was offered in Salem at the hospital for patients and employees alike. Dr. Brooks later said that he was worried that the patients might not like the film, but they loved it. I can't imagine the feeling, that the pride of these patients who worked on the film and how much they would have had. They were a part of it. It was filmed at their home. And the movie was received very well. And to really understand why, we have to understand the movement and the culture of the time. The 60s and 70s were tumultuous years. The US had just pulled out of Vietnam in 1975. The Watergate scandal had just happened. Unemployment was high and a recession was looming. As Christopher Lloyd said in the behind-the-scenes documentary, quote, "Anarchy was something people related to in the 60s and 70s," end quote. For Milos Forman, you may remember was from Czechoslovakia, the big nurse represented communism, and R.P. McMurphy represented the everyday people. Louise Fletcher said it was, quote, "about the power and misuse of power," end quote. And the film, it was an allegory of the times, and the people had spoken. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest went on to be the second film to receive all 5 main Academy Awards for Best Film, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Screenplay. Michael Douglas later noticed changes that came about because of the film. Prior to the movie's release in Florida, people could be arrested simply for exhibiting strange behavior. After the film, that law was eliminated. Maybe because people saw so much humanity, or maybe even themselves, represented in the patients from the film. The only negative review came from the American Psychiatric Association, who said that the film put mental health treatment in a bad light. They insisted that a documentary be made to accompany the film to show the actual treatment being conducted in psychiatric hospitals around the country. And so the documentary Inside the Cuckoo's Nest was filmed in 1977, again at Oregon State Hospital, again with crew members from the original film. But this time, for each scene in the film, the documentary showed a corresponding scene from Oregon State Hospital with real patients and real doctors. The documentary was not a success. Life kept moving on after Cuckoo's Nest was filmed. Started the first child and adolescent secure treatment program for children ages 8 to 18. In 1977, the Psychiatric Security Review Board, or PSRB, was created to supervise people who had been adjudicated guilty except for insanity. Quote, "The board was created to toughen sentences for mentally ill criminals and was composed of an interdisciplinary team of 5 members who did not work for Oregon State Hospital: a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a criminal lawyer, a person from the parole or probation system, and a member of the general public. The board had the authority to discharge patients on an early conditional release program when they were deemed mentally fit and no longer dangerous to themselves or others," end quote. In 1980 and 1981, Dr. Brooks also began supervising Damisch State Hospital in Wilsonville, following the previous superintendent's resignation. There had been intense scrutiny regarding charges of patient abuse and mismanagement, so he had quite a task ahead of him. On January 1st, 1982, Dr. Brooks retired from Oregon State Hospital. He had worked there for 34 years and 3 months and spent 27 years as superintendent. Dr. Brooks continued practicing medicine until 1999, when he officially retired. And in his decades of service, he never had a single complaint filed against him. Dr. Brooks died in Salem on May 30th, 2013, at age 96. His Wikipedia page describes him as a physician and an actor. And I remember reading about his passing that day because I was actually teaching One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in a writing class, and so it really stuck out to me. Following Dr. Brooks's retirement, Dr. James Bradshaw became superintendent of Oregon State Hospital on August 1st, 1982. He had been the associate superintendent for 11 years and had been acting superintendent immediately following Dr. Brooks's retirement. Also in 1982, a new sex offender treatment program started at Oregon State Hospital. By the following year, they offered a sexual aversion therapy program, which lasted 2 years and offered offenders the chance to reduce their sentences. The downside for them? Depo-Provera, a chemical castration agent, was frequently used. In 1991, physical castration came up for debate, but the ethical considerations of the procedure finally won out. A very strange story that honestly I don't fully understand ended up becoming the downfall of new superintendent Dr. Bradshaw. In November 1983, Art Frank, a property control manager at the hospital, handed over a 500-pound bronze sculpture of Christ to Secretary of State Norma Paulus. He said he had found the sculpture under some wooden screens, and apparently Mr. Frank had given the Secretary of State multiple items over the previous 2 years, such as pictures, furniture, and other historical items that he worried might be stolen if they remained at the hospital. And I don't really understand why he gave them to the Secretary of State or why they would have even been at the hospital to begin with. But apparently, the Secretary of State wanted to display the items while the hospital wanted to retain possession of them. The whole thing blew up into a scandal about the mismanagement of historical artifacts, and Dr. Bradshaw was forced to resign at the end of 1983 after serving only a little over a year as superintendent. On January 1st, 1984, Dr. Robert J. Benning was instated as On January 1st, 1984, Dr. Robert J. Benning was instated as superintendent of Oregon State Hospital. He had previously been the director of the Child and Adolescent Secure Treatment Program just down the street. But, like Dr. Bradshaw, Dr. Benning's time as superintendent would not last long. There was a shortage of staff members to accommodate the 657 patients and a number of administrative deficiencies. Funds from Medicare and Medicaid were cut due to problems with record keeping. The Joint Commission on the Accreditation of Hospitals pulled its accreditation of the hospital after finding 83 flaws in 1985 and 50 in 1986. You have to remember at this point, the hospital building itself is over 100 years old. There are bound to be some deficiencies, yes, but it's exceptionally important that they're addressed. Fortunately, those areas were able to be readdressed, and in January 1987, the Joint Commission reinstated its accreditation. Medicare and Medicaid also reinstated their funding. And as a side note, the Joint Commission, which we now call JACO, still investigates and audits psychiatric hospitals today. And it's really stressful when they come through. They look through everything, the building, units, documents, everything. And frankly, I'm glad they do. But I cannot imagine being stuck with 83 flaws, which you can bet were not minor issues. I would not want to be Dr. Benning. I don't have any information why, though I can speculate, but Dr. Benning resigned as superintendent on May 23, 1987. In his place, Dr. George W. Botchick became superintendent in December 1987. He had previous experience as a superintendent at Idaho State Hospital and was known for helping patients move into semi-independent housing, which was essential at this point of the deinstitutionalization process. Unfortunately for him, there was a surprise inspection the same month he started by the Public Health Division of the federal government. They cited a number of expensive problems that needed to be fixed before their return in mid-January, or the hospital would again lose its Medicare and Medicaid funding. To his credit, he was able to get many of those problems addressed. However, a number of dangerous patients had escaped during his administration, leading him to resign in 1991. At the time of his resignation, approximately 710 patients lived at the hospital. Dr. Stan Mazur-Hart became the superintendent of Oregon State Hospital on April 8, 1991. He had previous experience as the chief psychiatrist at Oregon State Hospital, as well as acting superintendent for 7 months in 1987 after the resignation of Dr. Benning. Dr. Mazur-Hart also had experience as a superintendent of Dammasch State Hospital starting in 1987. One of his first actions was to curb the number of escapes by enclosing the exercise area with more secure fencing and razor wire. I actually remember this happening and driving past the beefed up security for years afterward. Under Dr. Mazur-Hart, the use of restraints and seclusion also increased as a response to the increased violence. Improved security and increased staffing became a primary focus of Oregon State Hospital. Treatment providers became more like security guards than providers of treatment. In 1995, Dammasch State Hospital closed following decades of scrutiny over abuse and financial mismanagement. Between 1994 and 2003, there were 126 accusations of patient abuse at Oregon State Hospital, including accusations of neglect, as well as verbal and physical abuse. And I want to highlight the term accusations here. I'm not in a position to say whether or not these 126 acts of abuse actually happened. I hope they didn't, but I know it's certainly possible. Only those who experienced it know for sure. But that said, between 2001 and October 2004, there were 50 substantiated cases of abuse. In these instances, staff were said to have beaten, kicked, humiliated, and tormented patients. Some staff were said to call patients retarded and zombie. In 2003, a group of patients brought complaints against psychiatrist Dr. Falk, who had been at Oregon State Hospital since July 15, 1984. He was accused of withholding medications to patients that he deemed pill seekers. In one particular case, he was said to have ordered a patient to undergo 6 rounds of electroconvulsive therapy rather than return him to his previous medications. Other patients said he used derogatory language. Superintendent Dr. Mazur-Hart said there was insufficient evidence regarding the complaints, and as a result, he was asked to resign, effective July 22, 2003. On March 26, 2004, Dr. Marvin Fickle became superintendent of Oregon State Hospital. He had been the chief psychiatrist at the Oregon Department of Corrections since 1999 and superintendent of Dammasch State Hospital before that. Dr. Fickle wanted to restore the good image of Oregon State Hospital. He offered tours of the hospital, gave interviews, and pushed legislature for a bigger budget. Once again, in 2004, overcrowding was an issue again. The forensic programs designed to hold 404 patients now held 460. A co-ed ward meant for 30 now housed 44. There were 735 patients in a building that had turned 123 years old. By October 2004, more than 200 staff injuries had been recorded that year alone. That same month, patient Douglas Ashcroft tore the toilet seat off in his room and hit a male staff member in the side of the neck and then punched him in the face. Ashcroft was later arrested and charged with second-degree assault. In December 2004, another patient, Todd Van Dorn, beat and kicked a female staff member. As a result, video cameras and TV monitors were finally installed in the maximum security wards. Around the same time, the local Statesman Journal newspaper conducted a 2-month investigation into the conditions at Oregon State Hospital. They found 6 factors that led to the increase in staff injuries. 1, overcrowded and outdated facilities. 2, systematic problems with court orders committing alcoholics, drug addicts, and criminals who didn't belong there. 3, overly strict policies and monitoring by the PSRB. 4, failure to develop community housing for released patients. 5, severe institutional understaffing. And 6, failure to investigate and prosecute patient assaults against staff. During the tenure of Dr. Fickle as superintendent, patient violence increased and the worst problems at Oregon State Hospital were made known to the public. Not all of this was the superintendent's fault, however. Much of the blame could be placed on the buildings that were now over 120 years old and the lack of staffing. Where there should have been one nurse for every 5 to 6 patients, there was only one nurse for every 18 to 42 patients. And in my experience working in state hospitals, whenever there are significant staffing shortages, patient violence is going to naturally increase. One of the benefits to come from Dr. Fickle's tenure was that he was finally able to appeal to the public and to legislature that the hospital building was unfit to continue running in its current state. By 2005, entire wards had been abandoned due to structural issues. They were simply unsuitable to house patients. Superintendent in October 2007, and Dr. Roy Orr replaced him in February 2008. Dr. Orr had previously been a supervisor at Mackenzie Willamette Hospital in Springfield, Oregon for 14 years. Quote, his job included supervising inpatient programs and overseeing planned improvements in hospital operations and patient care programs, end quote. Dr. Orr's tenure was marked by high-profile escapes and a patient death in 2009 that captured the public's attention. On October 17, 2009, a patient named Moises Perez was discovered dead in his room on a medium security ward. Perez had apparently died from natural causes as a result of coronary artery disease. However, no one had seen him since breakfast, and he wasn't discovered until the distribution of evening medications. Moises Perez could have been saved if only someone had checked on him. The investigation into his death led to a number of staff dismissals and instigated much-needed change regarding patient care. Dr. Orr was asked to resign, effective April 1st, 2010. To his credit, Dr. Orr had helped reduce the use of seclusion and restraints to control violent patients. He had helped in opening 6 cottages as transitional housing for patients, worked to improve a new electronic record-keeping system for the hospital, and supervised the start of construction of the new buildings during his tenure. All of this was happening while the old hospital was being torn down. I remember going through this sort of mourning process for the loss of the old hospital. I had always found it so beautiful and so haunting that I just couldn't imagine Center Street without it. Seeing the large chain link fences around it and the hospital half crumbled just made me cry as I drove down Center Street. What a shame, I thought, but I had no idea how bad things had been inside or how desperately a new building was needed. On September 20th, 2010, Gregory Roberts became superintendent of Oregon State Hospital. He had previously been the assistant director at the New Jersey Division of Mental Health Services, where he oversaw 4 psychiatric hospitals. When he began in Salem, he had a lot of work to do. Construction on the new hospital had started the previous year, and the old hospital was still being demolished. Staff at the hospital were demoralized, and with time, they were able to reduce mandatory overtimes and create better staffing schedules. By 2012, construction of the new hospital was complete. The original Kirkbride structure was retained and remodeled for the administration and training areas, while the remainder of the hospital was completely redone. The new hospital has 620 beds in 4 different areas: Harbors, which is a maximum security area; Trails, a medium security area; Bridges, a minimum security area that also prepares long-term patients for discharge; and Springs, a medical and geriatric area. When Greg Roberts announced that he would be retiring, he had a clear sense of accomplishment. In a farewell message written in the Recovery Times, the monthly Oregon State Hospital newsletter, Mr. Roberts outlined the many achievements that had been made because of the collaborative effort of staff. In the same newsletter, staff also commented on his effectiveness as a leader and a communicator and his promotion of patient-centered care. Greg Roberts retired on March 31st, 2017, after serving in the role of superintendent for 6.5 years. The search for a new superintendent was in full force when I started my training at Oregon State Hospital in 2017. By early 2018, it was announced that Dolly Matucci would be stepping into the role. She had started as a dietitian at Napa State Hospital and served in multiple leadership roles before becoming the executive director of Napa State Hospital for about 8 years. There was a buzz of excitement about her starting. And as of this recording, in December 2022, Dolly Matucci remains superintendent of Oregon State Hospital. And that's where I'll end the history of Oregon State Hospital, although we know that there will continue to be new challenges and new accomplishments as the years go on. I hope that Oregon State Hospital will continue to be led from a patient-centered focus and that progress will continue to be made in terms of best practices for treatment, as well as for patient and staff safety. This hospital has been part of my own history literally since the day I was born, and I am so excited to be able to share it with you. In the next episode, I'm going to tell the stories of some of the people who lived and worked at Oregon State Hospital. Tune in to learn about the multiple members of one family who are all committed to the Oregon State Insane Asylum. Find out how a clergyman was allegedly tricked into being admitted into the hospital. And of course, we'll talk about the escapes. So many escapes. And so remember, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.